when I started to look at this, preparing this lecture again, I decided that there was so much confusion around the terms that I'd go back and have another look. And about 5 days later, I wrestled. I've wrestled something to the ground. This is a proposition for you, and as such, I mean, it is the result of trying to look at a whole range of different ways that the Academy uses the terms methodology and method. And of course, this is actually as it applies to practice-based research, the research that we're actually all involved with. So, just a couple of things. First of all, I just would like to thank 5 students who I worked with yesterday. And I'm going to read out the names because I'd hate to get them wrong. So, and I have to put my glasses on for this. It's hopeless, really. It's just hopeless. Okay, so Melanie, Nick, Stephanie, Will and Annie, who I ran by some of the kinds of processes that we're involved with. You'll be relieved to hear I didn't put any of the images up, but thank you. The second thing, as an aside to start with, many of you probably know this story. It's about an old man being asked what he imagined, how he imagined the world was held up. And he said, well, I know how the world is held up. It's held up on the back of a tortoise. And so the question then was, so what holds the tortoise up? And he just said very simply, it's tortoises all the way down. I'm going to begin. You may or may not come back to that.
I wanted you. And I was looking for you. But I couldn't find you. I wanted you. And I was looking for you all day. But I couldn't find you. I couldn't find you. You're walking, and you don't always realize it, but you're always falling. With each step, you fall forward slightly, and then catch yourself from falling. Over and over, you're falling, and then catching yourself from falling. And this is how you can be walking and falling at the same time.
That, of course, is Laurie Anderson. It's a very old piece now. Many of you probably know it really well. But I thought it was really important to start with an artwork, not the representation of one. So this is the story of a 10-year work. It's an old house in a little country town in central Victoria. It's also been an ongoing research project through creative practice. It's tricky. I'm going to read out a few of the words through this and you can find your way through it. Henk Borgdorf is a Dutch academic who has written extraordinarily well on practice-based research. In this first article, he's talking about what research itself is, as it is understood in the academy. And you can find these quotes similar to this in many different places. It's interesting, I think, to point out the last point. An additional requirement is that the research findings be documented and disseminated in appropriate ways. Of course, in our area, that's as much through exhibition as it is through writing in any journal. You'll probably hear already that I'm talking as an artist. And I know this room has in it people who are visual artists, designers, musicians, creative writers, people who design, well, they're designers, I guess, design games. There's such a range of people in here carrying out research. But I'm going to unapologetically continue to talk to you all as artists. And I'm doing so out of my sense that in this institution, we as artists are continually talked to as though we're designers. And you'll probably hear within this that there are some differences between how I talk about both art and design, and I'll differentiate those as I go. If I don't, you'll know I'm just talking to you as though you're an artist, unapologetically. So we're talking about methods. But we're also talking about methodology when we talk about methods. And I think you'll find that part of my despair occurred throughout this last week looking at these words is that they're used like pepper and salt kind of indiscriminately. Certainly equally by academics as by people in the popular press. So I really would like to, I think often, and it's actually been said a number of times now, that people use the word methodology when they want to sound important, when they want the kinds of processes that they're describing sound important. So you really need to be very careful about the use of the term, but know that you'll be tripped up in all kinds of places, including on the ARC proposal for discovery grants, which is fascinating. I'm tempted to write to them, having spent this week on this. Okay, so Borgdorf talks about artistic research. When artistic practice is not only the result of the research, but also its methodological vehicle, and the research unfolds in and through the acts of creating and performing. And he is actually right to use the word methodological there when he's actually talking about the kinds of range of methods or the particular method that we're addressing. When he's talking about methods, he can say methodological. Okay, another aside. What is called the scientific method always involves experiments. The scientific method is called a method because it is a way of going about doing things. It includes the use of statistics, which itself is also like a little umbrella under that larger umbrella, somehow gets to be called a method as well. In social science research, there are a number of different methods that are used, and you will have heard some of these names: the qualitative research method, the case study method, historical method, action research method, grounded research methods. They're all developments and elaborations and challenges to each other because, of course, the way in which research is done, the framework that you look at it actually changes what the research becomes. Sometimes, or actually more and more often in social science research, they use a mixture of those methods together. So again, when they talk about them, the range of methods that they're using, they're actually talking about their methodologies. Practice-based research, which is also here, which we're here calling creative practice research, and in Canada is called research creation, has a creative project as its method. That is how we do it. Yeah, through doing a creative project. And you can see the differences between these three when you understand that is actually the method that we're actually using. Okay, so scientists carry out experiments, and they actually call the experiments that they do techniques. Well, in the many readings that I did on it anyway, you'll probably come across some that don't do that. What does the Academy call what we do? So they call them methods. And sometimes, as I say, they're even methodologies. Okay, so we have a derelict house, an old house that was the start of a project. The builder told me that it was beyond repair. So I purchased this house as an artwork. People ask me if I live in it. Yes, I do, because the proposition that I started with, the question that I had, knowing that other people had made artworks from houses, but in order to do that, they'd actually had to destroy them. So I wondered what the possibility was of actually creating an artwork as a house where in fact it became increasingly more livable. Maybe, you know, in an eccentric way, but how would it be possible to do the opposite? Those of you who are interested in perhaps the best example of that is the artist Gregor Schneider. You might like to look up how destructive he has been. Okay, this is my proposition, that in order to make our lives a lot easier, a lot clearer, that we actually, within this method, which is that we create a project, but that we talk about the ways we go about creating that project as either a technique or a process. So a technique in a sense like science research does, or a process just as artists talk about it. And I think it makes it really so much clearer what it is that we're struggling with as we're putting something together to make an artwork or a design work. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about assuming that the project is method. I'm going to talk to you about my first process, and that is about being influenced by context. So the place is Avoca in central Victoria. It's an old gold mining town. It's on the Avoca floodplain just behind the main street. It has, it's almost completely monocultural. It's has suffered appallingly from the movement of people to the cities and the movement of services to the cities, and there is no railway line there. So there's not easy public transport. It's also a little bit out of town for people to take tourist-like day trips as they can to Daylesford or even Castlemaine. So it's, you know, people there keep on imagining that things are going to change, but actually I'm not so sure. This is the country. So it's over the dividing range. So the temperature is quite different from here. It's much hotter and drier in the daytime and colder at night. So it has very heavy frosts in winter. And this is the view from the house to, it's on the floodplain, and you can see across where you can see the bridge and the river, which at this moment has almost no water in it. If you get bored with this presentation, by the way, you can sit and see if you can count how many times the dog appears. She makes herself kind of available every time there's a photograph. It's kind of weird. Okay, so this is the house, 2011, with the large floods. It flooded about this deep through the house, part of the context. This is when the huge gum tree out the front simply broke in half. So what I'm talking here is the way in which we're not just affecting the environment, of course, but the environment is absolutely affecting us. Okay, with project as method, making the artwork. There are some things about the house that are really pertinent and were known to me at the start. The house is very particular. It's an immigrant house. It came out as numbered planks from Hamburg, and before that it went, I believe the prefabrication was done in Sweden, so it makes absolute sense of a whole history about IKEA. It was brought down, was laid out on the wharf in Geelong, and I think people must have been given plans. During the gold rush, there was a lot of importing of houses in Australia. Most of them were iron houses, and they came from Hong Kong. Some, however, came from Europe. Very few of them are left if they were timber, of course. So this is actually, I've only found 2 others in Australia that were left from this same importer. So they laid them out, and you actually walked along with your map. You decided how many rooms, what kind of configuration, and you actually collected up the bits and took them home and put them together. So once it was in Avoca, it was part of the pub. There it is in the main street in 1852. And you can see the section on how the hotel is a single story on the side, and that affects the construction of the house now. Then in 1870, you can see over here, it was sold because the pub was, of course, during the gold rush, the pubs made all the money. And so the pub wanted to expand, the hotel expanded, and they sold the house, which was then put on red gum rollers and rolled down the hill. And how I know that is that every single person in town can tell you that story. And they think it's kind of wonderful that this house kept on moving. And I do have to say, I do threaten people that if they give me a hard time, I'll move it again. But so you can see, you'll see from later images, this little black hole is where the front door was. That was where it was attached to the hotel. And it had a kind of a Juliet balcony. When we pulled the whole balcony off, which we had to, it's now facing west, it was impossible to live in. So I was very grateful that they added bits. This is Knoll. This is actually a video from a still from a video that's been shown in many places actually. Knoll was the previous owner. He's an artist. He died about 4 years ago, and the reason I have the house is because when he asked me why I wanted it when I was looking at it, he was delighted that I was an artist. He couldn't bear the thought that it might become a B&B. Now, he was in the early stages of dementia then, and he had to sell it. But he kept on, and he'd known that for years, and he kept on withdrawing it from the market because he'd actually spent time in Europe with some of the Australian artists of the time, Olsen, all of that ilk. And they were all very influenced by Bacon's work. Anyway, he came back, and his memories of that time, and he's quite a good artist. He actually won the Blake Prize on one occasion, and one of his works is in the Arts Centre. He was so enamoured of that time, and that's what he spoke to me about. He thought the idea of it becoming a house for another artist was really great. But I was phoned and told that once again he'd taken it off the market. This is after I'd done all this research. I'd even got my brother to lend me some money, all that stuff. And then when I was silent in despair, I was actually told that he'd taken off the market because he decided that I had to buy it, which was really wonderful. So he had the worry of the house taken off his hands, and he came to all of the events and marched around very proudly. And so he was still very much the owner of the house, actually. It was fantastic. Okay, numbered planks. This is also part of the context. This is, Avoca had thousands and thousands of Chinese people there during the gold rush. They had walked across, I don't know if you know the story, they'd walked across from Robe to the goldfields because they had to pay a tax if they got off the ship in Melbourne. And so they used to come single file thousands and thousands of Chinese people through the goldfields. And they spent a lot of time in the gold mines around Avoca. And this memorial was put up about 3 years ago, does it say? 2012. By the Chinese Foundation. They go around putting up little memorials in the cemeteries where there are funerary burners and references to Chinese people to actually make the case, to actually insist on visibility, which is wonderful. With the projector's method still, an address to the political. This is actually, was actually in the Sydney Biennale, 2012. Edward Said, some of you will know very well, was an extraordinary writer on addressing the colonial, challenging the colonial in particular. And you have to, this sense of this house, which was the first, as I knew from the start, its poetic power was in its actual experiential presence as a first generation boat house. It was an immigrant. It is an immigrant. It remains an immigrant. So the question becomes about how to fix it so that it becomes livable and people don't die in it, as they could well in Gregor Schneider's place. And of course, there are lots of those of you who are architects deal with the whole issue, often with very raised eyebrows, of the heritage issues that we now and requirements that are now in place in different councils. So this is it under repair. Okay, with projector's method, addressing sustainability with resources. Before I go on to that, just let's look at this statement by Borgdorf. It's not hypothesis-led usually, but discovery-led. And that actually has challenged some thinking that I had been doing, and I'm going to have to readdress that. I think it's a very interesting way to talk about what we actually do. A search on the basis of intuition, guesses and hunches, and stumbles across some unexpected issues or surprises on the way. The flooding of the house was a surprise, I have to say. The subject matter of the research is enclosed in the artistic material, or in the creative process, or in the transdisciplinary space that connects the artistic practices to meaningful contexts. I'll give you the reference to Borgdorf's book that this comes from at the very end. So this is about the sustainability issues and that sense of the repair. Those holes were from possums, and possums are still very much part of the house. Some of you probably have the same issues. The question is, of course, is what if you're thinking about working in a different way in relation to the world around you, how might we do that with possums? At the moment, the current strategy is to build a kind of a box in the roof, so when they go in, they only go into that, and it's got a little video camera so we can actually watch them, and so that so it might be a kind of a strategy like that, I think. This is from the back. So there's a workshop and a studio as well. You can see the kind of the sense of obvious repair. This is a private performance, public for the first time. That's probably about 100 years of dirt in those floorboards. Interestingly, again, for those of you who are architects, the base of the house, of the walls, is open, which makes it very easy for possums, it actually makes it very difficult for insulation given that it's on a floodplain. Because if I cover the bases in of the walls, then it will hold the water if it floods. And so what I've done as a strategy is I've tried to declare that the house to be flood friendly. I'll come back to show you why I did that later on. But this is up the back, so it's not so problematic. This is Mel Ogden, who I worked with on the landscape, if you like, and her son. This, in a sense, is very important. I found it online, and it took many of us to get it into the house, and it heats all of the hot water, including for hydronic heating through the house. The water, of course, is a huge issue, and so there are 3 types of water at this place. There's a big underground tank, and you'll see that. Which is a bit possumy, it's a bit tricky to drink it. There is town water, which was very saline, and so, bless their hearts, they put in a desal plant just for the town, because it was actually rotting out people's pipes. And of course there is imported water. And one of the biggest issues is this issue. It's really hard to get around it in the city, but it's actually an interesting ask to ask people how else they might actually bring their water. I'm having to address it. Pia is the only person I know who addresses it really well with your beautiful bottle that you bring with you. So this is the only town water in the house, in this little tap in the back room. And this is the building of the underground tank. It was a very innovative tank of the time. The lining of the workshop using timbers that were elsewhere. So there's that general rule of reuse and recycle. And so one of the rules that I have is that nothing leaves the property unless we can really justify it. This is Mel's courtyard. Mel is fabulous working with stone. And at that point, the whole land was designed to slow the water down. So my property goes to that fence at the back, the corrugated iron fence, which you can see. And we're looking from one of the windows of the house. You have to have a vegetable garden. And this is the most recognised image of the house, somewhat repaired. Looking pretty tatty, but it's the wabi-sabi version. Okay. I don't know, do some of you know of Stephen Johnson's work on innovation? If you don't, could I suggest that you actually just Google him and, on YouTube. There's a fantastic TED Talk and a couple of lectures that he's giving on innovation. The book reference, so I've actually had a chat with Stephen Johnson here. So he talks about the adjacent possible, fluid networks and platforms, slow hunches, serendipity, error, and acceptation as evidenced in various art projects. So he's talking about these as processes that we could use. Those of you who are in design will know much more about this kind of, will be much more familiar with this kind of language. Now, in terms of platforms and networks, I've given you a list of platforms and networks that have in fact influenced my own work. And you can look them up. They're pretty interesting if you don't know any of them. So there's Gertrude Stein's Salon, the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College, Anna Halprin's Dancers Workshop, the London Filmmakers Co-op, and the Organ Factory in Clifton Hill. They're all from the 50s to the beginning of this century. So there's a sense of history about them, but they're examples of we can look back on them. That's why they're history, and see just how influential they have been. So what they're talking about is the way that artists in grouping together have been able to do something that's been so much more potent and powerful than if they had been sitting by themselves. But it takes particular kinds of artists, and it takes particular kinds of fortitude, I think. So, okay. So Jones et al., that's the team here, on discipline beginnings. So I looked at some of the ways that we actually do actually begin: the script, the storyboard, the score, the sketch, the model. There are others that you might well know of. These are really well known. Part of course, what is wonderful about knowing the range of them, I remember I applied for money to the film commission, it was called at the time, to make just a little film. You know, I wanted $15,000 or something to make this little film. And they actually said to me, but you have to put in a storyboard. Because I'd sent in a kind of a treatment. And, you know, the thing about storyboard, and it's my problem with PowerPoint too, is that it's a series of stop actions. And so the goingness of moments is actually is then a second generation of thinking. It's not something that you start with. So I happen to know that Wim Wenders doesn't storyboard for that reason. So I wrote to them and I said, I don't storyboard, but neither does Wim Wenders. so they reluctantly gave me the money. Okay. So what I'm suggesting here is that there are different attitudes to those beginnings. You can have an attitude to it. You don't have to do any of these things, and it's the challenge, and it's the ways that we deal with them that are really, I think, the interesting ways. Okay, specific material practices, ways of collecting materials, of combining them, and of altering them. So a material practice is an overall term, but within it, that we're actually talking about material. Yeah. So the use of constraints, rules, chance relations, particular forms and genres are all particular kinds of constraints. Those of you who are poets would understand, in looking at the haiku, that is probably the most corseted kind of constraint that you could have. But in fact, its very, very corseted nature requires that you actually go to a place far beyond your own normal kind of easy pattern of thinking. The Feldenkrais method is, again, that word method, is a particular physical method that works with the use of constraints a lot. And the philosopher Brian Masumi talks of enabling constraints, which is a lovely way of putting it. Improvisational techniques. Now, because there's not really a theatre group here, some of the musicians will understand this, but there's an extraordinary teacher in the theatre, or has been, and he wrote a book called Impro, and his name's Keith Johnson. And he gives all of these exercises in ways to actually get people beyond their known inhibitions. And one of the ways, there's an example of a way that he works, which is what is simply called in the theatre the yes and impro. And it goes like this. You ask two people to go and sit on a bench. I won't do it to you. It's all right. They need to speak with each other, but they must. So one of them will make an offer to the other about anything. It's a nice day, don't you think? And the other person has to say yes. And I noticed this morning, because the sun was shining in a very particular way, that I could see this tiny hole in the fence. And so I went over and I looked through it. And then they look back at the other person, who then has to say yes and they continue on. And what actually happens is that there's a tendency that we have when we're making work, which is to say yes, but, or no. And what that means is that you never get off a starting point. So this yes and improvisation says that it doesn't matter where you start. If you keep on yes anding, which is elaborating, or what does Stephen Johnson call it? Thank you. That's nice. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what that. I'm not too sure about exculpation. You might have to look him up again. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah. So in this, basically, he's actually saying that an artwork. You're sitting there. I bet you many of you thinking, your design work or your artwork, this big project, how are you going to start it? It's got to be important, it's got to have this, it's got to have that. And I'm actually saying to you, if you really believe in the process of simple elaboration, using material practice and a whole range of different strategies, using conversations, using reading, doing a whole range of things, you're taking a series of steps and you end up a long way away from this very kind of shallow starting point. If you're constantly critical of it, you're constantly only at the starting point. If you have never tried it, what you can do it, you can actually do it with somebody else just as a writing exercise. But I would challenge you, if you think your idea is too small or too banal at this point, I would actually challenge that, unless you've already done a year and a half's material practice and it's still small and banal, in which case I'd be suggesting that maybe it's a problem. Okay, recording strategies. These will influence, of course, the work itself. So you may decide that you're going in terms of the handmade, the analogue, the digital. Interaction strategies with audiences, viewers, clients. So the whole Nicholas Bourriard, for those of you who know his work in the visual arts, his book Relational Aesthetics created an extraordinary paradigm shift, is the only word for it, in the way that many, many artists began to actually work with their ideas of process and their ideas of who the audience is and what constitutes an audience. Framing devices. So the stage with curtains is a particular framing device. The cinema is a framing device. You know when you go into those places what it is that you're addressing. You know how to behave. You know how to behave when you go into a contemporary gallery. Sometimes. Now, of course, because there's been a change in the way people have been relating to audiences, it's all up for grabs, and it's driving museums mad, so which serves them right, I think. Okay, processes developed by others. And I'll give you an example of Lawrence Halprin's RSVP cycle. Lawrence Halprin was a landscape designer. He made this cycle in the 60s, or maybe the 50s even. And he lived outside San Francisco. Anna Halprin was his wife, and she was probably the most influential dancer in terms of contemporary dance in the world, really. In Western dance, sorry, not the world, but Western dance, and it has actually influenced a lot of others. So in terms of the movingness of moving. Lawrence Halprin's designed a cycle which was for working with people to create a design project. And it was the RS, the R stands for the resources, so you figure out what all your resources are, what you've got to work with. S is the score. V is value action, where you actually look at you try and determine what are the values that are underpinning what you're doing. And then P is the performance. And then, of course, it goes around. It's not a circle, it's a spiral. So it develops in sophistication in that yes and way as well. Interestingly, what's his name? The Canadian filmmaker who he has alopecia and he does really fabulous films and theatre pieces. Is it? Yeah, I think you're right.
It's a hard one to
yeah. Anyway, I'll think of his name. I'll think of his name next time, and I'll just tell you, or later in the day. There's a very lovely an artist who works in extraordinarily lovely ways in Australia. His name is George Coote, and he works with medical in medical situations where he creates these kind of design works that are feedback art loops with people in hospitals. But you can look up his work. He's done some very interesting works in the past, and he has cited this cycle himself. And then very recently, a PhD student who's just completed and made a very, very beautiful PhD by project, started with this RSVP cycle, and then started, and in fact she ended up with, and she completely transformed it. So she was dealing with a whole kind of process that she calls scorography. So it's actually not just the repetition of these, but it's actually the turning them inside out to create something else that enables us, I think, to often work towards something that is a contribution to the culture. How am I going? It's all right? Mm. Okay, okay, training techniques. So my own training was in movement, apart from going to university. But so I used to go around and traipse around the world and work with different movement people. And there was a woman in New York called Lyndal, and she reckoned that she could tell what kind of gym equipment a person walking down the street had used because of the particular musculature that they had developed. And why I'm saying that is because whatever the movement system that we use, whether you do yoga, whether you're a footballer, whether you're, all of those systems have a very, very particular training. And so we become different through those trainings. And so those trainings affect the kinds of things that we end up doing. And while I'm talking there about movement trainings, I'd like to ask you about academic trainings. Yeah, the kinds of for you to consider, the kinds of influences that you've had, the kinds of ideas that you're drawn to. So, out of all of those things, I'd been at this house for about 6 years. And I have to tell you that all this time I've been waiting. People came, they did wonderful things, all sorts of things were happening. I would make artwork there with people, take them to other places. And this is another example of waiting to discover what it is that this artwork was about. I had a sense that I really didn't know, and so I was doing a lot of tap dancing to cover that up. So rehearsing catastrophe, I had decided that the house, because Ararat is the next town, and so the Ark was of course landed on Mount Ararat, and it had been 8 years drought, and it was a double-storey house that seemed to almost look like an ark. So I decided I wanted to build an ark, and then I realised that it was too expensive, and so the idea was to turn the house into an ark through projection. So just to use a very big projector. And I have to say I went along to the Business and Tourism Committee because you can't do anything that requires, I thought I'd have a lot of people there with their animals, and we would do the whole ark thing as a kind of a big, fun, outrageous event. And I went along to the Business and Tourism Committee, and I waited to speak. They make sure I speak last, and because I'm a greenie. And so they finally let me speak, and I said, well, I'd just like to inform you that this is what I'm going to do, and I'd love you all to be involved and all of this. And they said, you want to bring animals? And I said, yes, I'm very excited I was. I thought it was a great idea. And this guy said, you'll never get a permit. And that was it. And so my response to that was, well, we'll dress up then. And so I marched out, and of course that's what the piece became. So, you know, things happen in all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of constraints that occur that I think are very interesting and that maybe we need to learn to welcome. Another thing about the boat, this was taken in south of Spain, just north of Malaga. There's this extraordinary image. Boats appear in all kinds of places, you know, in people's sheds, on their back lawns. You must have seen them. There's this thing in Australia that, you know, of building the boat, and it never goes anywhere. It's, you know, it's wonderful. And then there's this. So these are kind of things that happened and came together over time. This is in Paris, and I was there. This actually was after I had done the Ark in Evoca. And I was walking through a lovely garden, and I came to this little museum. And it was an Ark. It's full of stuffed animals. It's extraordinary. I'd love to show you lots of the photos of them. They're really wonderful. So all of those things started to meld to become not only the first version of the Ark, but the second one. There'll be some images. What influences these? Cultural, gender, political, geographic and historical contexts, as well as sexual preferences. That's from yesterday, thank you. Observational, auditory, kinesthetic, empathic and analytic skills available and learned. Other works in your own or associated cultural fields, and your value system, which is usually unspoken. The trick, I have to say, in making a work of any kind, I think, of design or art, is to try and find some way in which the unspoken values can actually find a way to be addressed. All of us can make something shiny and nice. What is it to make something powerful and authentic that challenges you is the question, I think. So here's the Ark when it went to Sydney. In Evoca, everyone made their own costumes, and they were fabulous. For Sydney, I worked with some people, and a very fine artist, craftsperson, Jeff Neal, some of you may know him, built the boat for me, and it travelled up to Sydney in 2 halves. It's, of course, just the front. And it sits at the opening of a joiner's shed, which is on the cliff at Cockatoo Island. So just the right place for an Ark to be, completely ridiculous. It was a boat-building island, it has to be said. So we covered all the other windows over and had the hyperreal sounds of building inside. And inside also a video that I simply call Miliana, and I'll show, I think I get to show you that in a moment. So these are some of the things that I've mentioned, and I'll just mention in a sense again. On Epiphanies is the sudden big kind of slow hunches. The slow hunch, I think, is in a sense what the whole, this is Johnson's term. It's a wonderful term, because he talks about the time it takes for something to happen, and actually for the Evoca project, the time it took for me to understand what the work is has been 10 years. On material practice, I think you may hopefully have some sense of what that is for yourself. On yes and, Johnson calls this the adjacent possible, that's what it is. Okay, on the use of a notebook for the development of ideas. Okay, work one day, shop one day is mine. basically. And Johnson talks about walking, but I've wanted to really also point out that Leslie has a whole art practice of many years, extraordinary art practice that is centrally involved in walking. And I've quoted the reference at the back. I hope you get to talk. I hope you talk about it. Yeah. The brick wall, which is where you come to a dead end. Okay, you know, there's a Feldenkrais saying, which is, if something doesn't work, you don't just keep on hammering it. It's, if something doesn't work, try anything else. At least two perspectives can be offered on what artistic research has to offer. He's talking about a constructivist approach and a hermeneutic approach. Oh. Okay, with the constructivist perspective, objects and events actually become constituted in and through artworks and artistic actions. So it's actually, you have the experience of something in the same way that you experience Laurie Anderson's music. It didn't represent it, it was it. So there's a difference between the experience and the representation. And what that sense of the constructivist approach is, that is one of creating something that exists in the world. The hermeneutic perspective assumes that artistic practices and artworks disclose the world to us. The world-revealing power of art lies in its ability to offer us those new vistas, experiences and insights that affect our relationship with the world and with ourselves. Maybe there's something in there of talking from the maker's side and something perhaps from the viewer's side. And the different kind of emphasis in those. I don't know, think about it. It just came to me as a possibility. This leads to unfinished reflection. Its primary importance lies in explicating the implicit or non-implicit knowledge enclosed in art. It's directed at a not knowing or a not yet knowing. It creates room for the idea that all things could be different. So, in a sense, when I make something, it's not finished at the time of exhibition. It's just where it is then. The next day I could make it again. You've probably had this experience yourselves in either making or even in being able to describe something that you've done. Like when you're very close to it, it's really hard to describe. Do I talk about it like this or this or this or this? 10 years later, you can kind of talk about it in this way. It's not any more real. It's just another way of talking about it. But it's also very, very interesting in terms of the possibilities, I think. It's also very interesting for a group of people who are struggling and looking at a 3-year deadline and thinking, but I've got to have it, I've got to have it solid and sorted and all of these sorts of things. I hope you're getting the impression that this is a sense of continuing elaboration. I'm wanting to reassure you that that is possible, that this doesn't have to be a deductive activity. Okay, supported by specific writers. Claire Doherty is an extraordinary, she's a curator who works, she's got an organisation that's actually called Situation, and it used to be tied to the University of Western England and is now a free commissioning agency in England. But she's written a number of books about place that I think are really, where she talks about place in a really really interesting way, where she gives an overview. She's written something on Evoca, and I'm just about to put it on the website. It's called Thinking Through Evoca. Okay, again, Mi-Hwan Kwan is somebody who's absolutely challenged those kinds of ideas of site specificity and place and the fixedness of place. Look, a lot of artists like working with ideas about place. Let me tell you, there has been a lot of writing on it. You have to read the breadth of the writing and know the kind of history of it if you're going to deal with it. And I suspect you will be changed in your thinking by doing that. There's some very interesting thinking on it. Okwin Wazor is an extraordinary South African curator. I think he's the curator for the next Venice Biennale. and he ran probably the most important exhibition in the world, 2001, I think, called Documenta, where he developed that whole huge exhibition around this idea of the artist as producer in times of crisis. And as I kept on producing events and tap dancing and thinking, I wish I knew what this project was about, this was very healing. This idea was something to grasp, because indeed I was obviously doing a lot of producing, and it was clear that so were a lot of other artists, as we struggled to find ways of connecting our work and our thinking to that of others. Okay, process 41, other artists. This is a work by Jane Prophet. Jane has done a lot of online work. Some of you may know her work that way. I think she's currently Professor of Art in one of the universities in Singapore. She came and did a very early work, and this work is uses photofluorescent line, and she created this big graph, and it was based on the flood levels that occurred at that site. And that's what enabled me to look across and see how high up the wall that went, and to then create a house out of that connection, a flood-friendly house, because the other way was I could only move it or turn it into a fortress. So it was out of that connection with Jane. This is another view of the work. It was huge and extraordinarily beautiful. This is Carl Michael von Hauswolf, who's a sound artist, extraordinary sound artist from Sweden. And he worked with a dozen sound students from SILE here and created a big sound piece on the front veranda. And the cops turned up, and they in their car, and they kind of pulled up and they sat there, and an hour later they were still there. It was fantastic. This is Natalie Jeremijenko. One of the rules that I developed after talking with other artists was that that I shouldn't let artists come to town and try and work with the local people, because what they tended to do was always patronising. And people were very busy, and so I developed a rule that they may only work with one person in the town who I would introduce them to, who was an expert, who could tell them something. And of course then other people in the town became interested because there was someone from the town who was actually the expert. So Martin Wynne is the man with the curls, is an extraordinary soil expert, and this is his property. And Natalie was there with a chef from New York to make soil cocktails, so we had a soil cocktail party. She then did some big gigs in Melbourne too, but this is a residency and workshop, the result of, run by Linda Jackson, a textile workshop. Okay, so then there are changes that occur through the art event. This was an eco-festival that I ran. You can see Noel there coming out to visit people. People actually had to pay by we figured out how much petrol they'd spent, and they had to buy the requisite number of trees. And the people in town had decided that this was going to be dreadful, it was going to cost them too much, and they weren't going to be allowed in, and the gossip all went around town. And so when they turned up and they realised that it actually, because if they walked there, they could get in for free, and people from Melbourne were paying a lot, they were buying a lot of trees, they couldn't work it out, it was too hard. This is an absolute expert. Those of you, I don't know if you know Peter Andrews, some of you may know, who are involved in the ecological movement. Peter Andrews has been on the Australia Story a couple of times. He's the developer of natural sequence farming. It's this man here. And the strategy of slowing water down, it goes against land care, drives them mad. It goes against a whole range of different kinds of known understandings, even by those working in the organic area. So he's actually trying to implement what we would call a paradigm shift, and those of you who are interested for those of you who are interested, he's absolutely fascinating. So he influenced the project right from very early on. You may recognise some of the people. There's a kind of casual planting performance at that same event. This is the Eco Festival here. That was a field day. This is a flag. It's the Eureka flag in green, done by Ash Keating. For the same event, Fiona Harrison worked with a group of about 15 landscape architecture students from here. She actually did it over a couple of years, and they worked on people's properties, and everyone marched around the town to see where the gardens were that the students had worked on. Jill Orr is a lovely artist, worked with the kids at the school making eco cubbies. They're pretty wild. Lily Hibbard read to people from stories that they selected, that she'd kind of gathered. Leslie Duxbury did a beautiful series of smoke. And Megan Evans and Gail Madigan did a work where they went around town and they collected people's images of welcoming them in. And they made a huge video work that was put on in the RSL hall. What was really wonderful about this is the moment. Gail had been working there for quite a long time. And I had realised at that stage that there are two silences in the town that were really profound. One is the silence about the Chinese people. And in fact, some of the gravestones had been desecrated. So it was pretty worrying. And the other, even bigger silence was the Indigenous silence. And the question is how to deal with those. So at this point, Gail had been there for a number of weeks, actually, working with people, going into their homes, taking videos. Everybody loved her. And at this point, she told them that she was an Indigenous artist, and she welcomed them to country. Okay, this is the Rehearsing Catastrophe piece. Again, this is really about working with, some animals were allowed. This is the house as an ark. So people actually came right out onto the floodplain and then walked in. The person in yellow is a very fine actor, Julie Forsyth. I don't know if you know her. She did a kind of an air steward's welcome. Limited luggage, children, babies first, pairs. This is where people created their own masks. Okay, Bergdorf. This is interesting because I think it may affect some of you. This idea of methodological pluralism, the view that various approaches deriving from the humanities, social sciences, or science and technology may play a part in artistic research. It should be regarded as complementary to the principle that the research takes place in and through the creation of art. So you don't have a kind of an idea here and an artwork there. You're thinking through the art and design practice. If you start to apply other things, and in fact, you could say this is the case study. If you're talking in case study language, this is the case study. It's not other people. Other people, you're actually showing how you fit the contact with other people, the connection. More recent connections with the town. Okay. Some writings. This has been very important for me. We can rely neither on the scientific mind nor on our common sense. They both mutually reinforce each other's blindness. The situation is like that. This is climate change. The situation is like that of the blind spot in our visual field. We do not see the gap. The picture appears continuous. So the question becomes, for those of us interested in trying to find a way to articulate this, to communicate with people, to create positive actions around this, is what constitutes the gap. Okay, taking elements off site, I'm going to have to hurry. Okay, Tears for What was done down at Acker, 200 44-gallon drums. Work up at Project Space, yeah, with Gosha Wodlarczyk and a number of other artists. She'd worked at the house. This is a work that was shown at Anna Schwartz Gallery, was in partnership with a work in Korea called The Bridge of No Return. This is a work called Whispering Wall, part of a series I did with four other artists called Propositions for an Uncertain Future. What you hear in the Whispering Wall are people's feelings about climate change from Avoca. I was shown again in Sydney, the MCA. Okay, something in the world, this is Deleuze, forces us to think that something is not an object of recognition, but a fundamental encounter. So again, I'm talking about experiences, I'm talking about engagements, I'm not talking about representations. And Erin Manning, we are at an ecological, environmental, political impasse. This project seeks, and I'm using it, she's talking about a different project, but I'm saying this project. This project seeks to attend to these issues, to address where the human fits within the problematic of existence today. And I have to say, that is the kind of writing and thinking and engagement with people that I've had really only in the last couple of years, that have really articulated in a way that I was searching for but would never have found without, I think, without those connections. A deeper sense, a sense of what constitutes the deep value that enables me to continue with this work. A sense of what constitutes a different way of relating, not as humans in control of a world, but as of participants in a world. There's an Australian philosopher, Bradotti talks about the post-human, and she's written about that. And Erin Manning talks about the more than human. And a number of us here have been actually involved, and I have really, really welcomed that connection. It's been fabulous. So it's through people, it's through rigorous ideas, it's through finding a value system that not just matches one's own intuitions, but where you can actually then understand the kind of rigour that's involved in chasing it, in finding it, in delving into it in real detail. Oh, I'm going to finish on this point.
Or you had to fetch water from special places in the city, and they were usually bombed, you know, while we were standing in the queues waiting for water. We couldn't, yeah. A lot of people were killed waiting for water.
Okay, so it's 1 o'clock. We could go on, but I think you get the general idea. So thank you for your attention.